Okay, today we're going to be talking about the vertebrates, and you can see up here a phylogenetic tree of vertebrates. What scientists think, what do they think is the closest phylum related to the vertebrates? The phylum that's the most closely related. Echinoderms. Because echinoderms and chordates both are in what group? Deuterostomes. Their embryo, the blastopore in the embryo, develops into the anal opening instead of the mouth. All the other groups, it's mouth first. So this is supposed to be the ancestral chordate back here. Whoops. Marker's not working right again today, I see. This is vertebrates. So I'll make a distinction between chordates and vertebrates in a minute, because there is a small distinction. Chordate is the big group. Notice that these in white here are outlined. These guys in white are chordates, but not vertebrates. And I'll tell you why in a minute. All these other things obviously are vertebrates. This is your phylogenetic tree of all the different kinds of vertebrates there are. Remember, we'll talk about these two later. Not going to talk about them so much today. I will tell you why they're not vertebrates, but it's going to be next time before we actually talk about what they do, what they're like. This is what it takes to be a chordate. First of all, to be a chordate, you have to be an animal, which means you have to be eukaryotic, multicellular, heterotrophic, motile with no cell walls. They're also deuterostomes. You've got all the characteristics of advanced animals, plus these things. At some point in time in embryonic development, or as an adult, they have this ride in their back, dorsal side, the back side, called the notochord. You don't have that as an adult. Most vertebrates don't have that as an adult. They have this ride during embryonic development, and it later develops into the disc between your vertebrae. What are those little discs between your vertebrae? What are they made out of? You got a little padding disc between your vertebrae. What are they made out of? Cartilage. So eventually, this notochord in most vertebrates becomes these discs. But those two things that we saw before, the tunicates and the lancets, they don't ever develop a backbone like you have. They keep this their whole life. So that's what makes them chordates, but not vertebrates. They never develop a vertebral column the way you do. They just keep this support rod. Also, something you might not have known that you have at some point in time in your life is gill slits. Now, obviously, as adults, most vertebrates, except fish, don't have those. But during embryonic development, you have gill slits, just like shark has on the side of its neck. Those go away before you're born. The supports for those eventually help to create the jaws. That's where our jaws come from. Also, at some point in time during embryonic development, you had a tail. Obviously, before you were born, that went away, hopefully. There are people born with a short tail sometimes. Same place a monkey's tail would be. But they've searched to remove that. They're not going to let them keep it for long. But these are all things that every chordate, and thus every vertebrate, has at some point in time during their life. A notochord, a support rod that eventually becomes part of the vertebral column. Gill slits. This tail, and also chordates are all deuterostomes. The anus forms first during embryonic development. And remember those first two groups, the ones that were outlined in white in our phylogenetic tree, those guys never really develop a vertebral column, a backbone. They keep this notochord their entire life. Now, phylum Chordata is divided up into several clades, or several divisions, several groups. One of those are the craniates. Cranium obviously means what? Head. So these vertebrates, these chordates, possess a distinct head and at least a two-chambered heart. And the group that we'll talk about there is a class called Myxinea. And these things are called the hagfish. Sometimes they're called agnathans. Let me tell you why. What does A mean? It's the prefix A. No or not. And natha, G-N-A-T-H, means jaws. No jaws. So these are fish without jaws. They're, but they do have a head. These things are, usually they attach to something and parasitize it. They attach to another fish or some other animal, and they basically, it's kind of like vampire fish. They suck the guts out of other animals. But they don't have any jaws. They have, I'll show you a picture in a minute. They have like a sucker head with two little sharp fang-like teeth. They bite in and then they attach with their sucker and then they just suck out blood. Guts.
Is that like a whole different class?
This is the first class in this phylum. Remember, it goes kingdom, phylum, class. So we're working our way down. We're in kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. This is the first class. Hagfish, simple, jawless fish. They're the most simple vertebrates with a head. Now remember that vertebrates in general, what makes a vertebrate is that a vertebrate has to have this hard backbone that surrounds and protects its spinal cord, its nerve cord. Most chordates are vertebrates. The exception to that rule are those two things we looked at in white over there, the tunicates and the lancets. Here's some general characteristics of all the vertebrates. Vertebrates typically are large and active compared to other animals. They have a high degree of cephalization. What does that mean again? Cephalization. Lots of development in the head, lots of sense organs, usually a pretty defined brain, but a lot of sensation kinds of materials in the head. We have an axial endoskeleton. Axial means it runs which way? It's an axis. What makes your axial skeleton? Your backbone, pretty much, right? It runs up and down. Your backbone and your ribs make your axial skeleton. The rest of your skeleton branches off of that, right? You have the axis going down the middle. Everything else branches off the axial skeleton. And a good thing about our skeleton that's different than arthropod skeleton is it grows with us. We don't have to shed it. We don't have to molt. That's a good thing. Vertebrates tend to have two pairs of appendages, arms or legs. We have these cartilaginous discs in between our vertebrae. Those are important because what do they keep from happening? Yeah, bone rubbing on bone is a bad thing, right? They keep the vertebrae from rubbing on each other and causing pain and damage. What happens to those vertebral discs during the day? Try this tonight. When you get home, find a wall and reach up as high as you can reach. And get somebody to make a little pencil mark on the wall or wherever. Maybe do that in your garage so you won't get in trouble for marking on the wall. Reach as high as you can. Lay down, go to sleep tonight, wake up in the morning as soon as you get up and go do the same thing. In the morning, you're going to reach further or less far? Further. Because during the day, you're standing up a lot of the time. What's your weight doing to those little discs between your vertebrae? Putting pressure on them and squishing them. And they actually squish down. The more you're up during the day, the shorter you get. And at night they re-expand, and you get a little bit taller at night because you're laying horizontal, and all that weight's not pushing in on those things. They're important to keep your vertebrae from pushing on each other. Here's what now? I mean, unless you're reaching, probably not. That's why I said make a little mark for the highest point you can reach, and then you can tell. And it's going to be a pretty good distance in terms of how much you shrink during the day. The vertebrates also have a really good respiratory system for the most part. And the advantage of that, better respiration means more what? More activity, because more oxygen means more what? More cell restoration, which means more ATP. So it lets us be more active. Better respiration, more activity. Same thing with circulation, right? Because what's the main thing that's circulating? And what's the main thing circulating in the blood? Oxygen. So again, more activity. We have an advanced digestive system. The big advantage of that is it lets us eat what? If you have a really good digestive system, what does that mean you can eat? Pretty much anything. So it gives you a lot more food sources when you have a really good digestive system. And obviously it lets you absorb more nutrients and thereby have more energy and thereby be more active, right? So all those things are important. And then that advanced nervous system lets us do things like think and learn and remember that a lot of those animals underneath us, they can't do. So vertebrates in general, this is what it takes to be a vertebrate. And here's our another phylogenetic tree of chordates. Now remember, these two over here are chordates, but not vertebrates. They don't have a vertebral column. Everything from here on over does. Notice that along each branch, what do we got? What are these things in white? They're adaptations, things that made one group different from the group before it. And notice, the big jump from here over to somewhere in here was jaws. Why are jaws such a big deal? They let you eat a lot of different stuff, right? If you're just a little sucker fish, what can you eat? Not much. But if all of a sudden you got these big jaws like a shark, you can eat a lot of different things, right? Notice the lungs are in there, the development of limbs. Anybody know what an amnion is? Yeah.
Is it the webbing around like we are developing? It's like
It's the sac that encloses the embryo. Basically encloses the embryo in what? In a bag of water, right? So that lets us do what without being aware? If you're enclosed in a bag of water, you can reproduce without being aware of the water. Right? You can reproduce on land because you're actually developing in a bag of water without having to go to the lake and reproduce, right? And then we got hair, obviously hair, mammary glands, breast, feathers. So we'll get each one of those along the way. Let's talk about these hagfish. Supposedly the hagfish were the first fish to evolve. Again, they're jawless. And we said sometimes they're called agnathans, meaning no jaws. There's sometimes they live on the bottom of water, typically. They can be filter feeders or scavengers. There's a very similar class of fish called lampreys. These guys also don't have jaws. But what they do have is they have a notochord surrounded by cartilage. So it's sort of the beginnings of what? It's not exactly the same as your backbone. It's what your backbone made out of mostly. Bone. Backbone. They've got a back cartilage, basically, right? We'll rename it. Their notochord, that hard support eye they have, becomes surrounded by cartilage. So they are vertebrates. They're considered vertebrates. They don't have any appendages, which means no arms, no legs. They do have a big fin on their back, a dorsal fin. And these lampreys have this radula-like tongue. What had a radula that we talked about already? Yeah, mollusks, like snails and slugs. Remember that radula is like a tongue that looks sort of like what? What does a radula look sort of like? Sort of like a chainsaw. And that tongue was used to scrape and scratch, to eat. These lampreys are usually parasites. These are the ones that usually attach to other fish. And there's a lamprey. And you can see here's its sucker-like head, and you can see those teeth. They're going to bite on and they're going to suck guts out of things. You can see these little gill slits down here, which remember you have at some point in time during your development. It does look painful. All right, now let's move on up to the next group of fish called gnathostomes. What would that word literally mean? Gnathostome. Okay, jaw means, gnath means jaw. What's stone mean? Like protostome, deuterostome. What? Mouth. Jaw and mouths. Mouth, yeah, jaw and mouth is the easiest way to think about it. They have jaws around their mouth. Now, we're going to talk later about this term right here, a Hox gene. The Hox genes are the genes that basically control how we develop, our main structures. So to completely change an organism, to make something a big change like jaws, there has to be a mutation in those genes, those main genes that control your development, the Hox genes. And what scientists think is that one of the genes that coded for the gill slits mutated, and that led to the development of jaws. There's a couple of groups of jawed fish. One group, chondrichthyes. Now I want you to recognize some terms here. Anyone know what chondra means? C-H-O-N-D-R? Means cartilage. And ichthyes means what? Fish. Cartilage fish. There are actually classes in college, there are people who do this for a living, called ichthyologists. They study fish. The chondrichthyes are the cartilage fish, like sharks and like manta rays and stingrays. Their teeth are the only bones in their body. Their skeleton is mostly made out of cartilage. That's got some advantages and disadvantages. What's the advantage of having a skeleton made out of cartilage? It's lighter, which means they can do what? Move faster. Sharks need to be able to move fast, right? They're predators. The disadvantage maybe is it's not quite as strong as bone, but it's lighter, lets them move faster. They have hard, scaly skin. Anyone ever touched shark skin? It can actually cut you, right? If you rub it the wrong way, it can cut you. Because it's almost like teeth. It's almost like your skin has teeth. Sharp. But that skin is there to prevent desiccation. Because where do they live? In what kind of water? Salty water. And what do we know salty water does to things that have less salt in them? Pools of water out. All right. Even though the shark is living in water, it's in constant danger of what? Dry it out. Because the water is more salty than it is. And the water wants to go out. So that thick, scaly skin helps keep water in, helps to keep it from drying out, from desiccating. Obviously, things in this group have muscular fins, powerful jaws. Most things in this group have pretty good vision. And olfaction is just another word for smell. There's all kinds of myths about what a shark can smell at one drop of blood a mile away. I don't know if that's true, but they can smell really, really well. They also have this thing called a lateral line. It runs down their body, and it helps them to pick up sounds and also vibrations. A lot of fish have this line of sensory tissue going down their body, lateral line, that helps them to do that. And I know you guys can't see this very well because the screen is not exactly right here. It says the cloaca. Cloaca serves as the anus and reproductive tract opening. Sounds kind of interesting. The anus and the reproductive tract opening. Now that's the case in several groups of birds, like frogs, for example. Their reproductive opening is also their waist opening. Cloaca is basically a pouch I found at the end of what? Have I ever dissected a frog? Nobody dissected a frog? At the end of the large intestine is this pouch and frog called the cloaca. But it not only sends out the poop, it also sends out the sperm or the eggs, because the reproductive system and the urinary system, they all dump into that same pouch. It's the way it works in sharks and rays as well. So there's a shark. Remember, these are chondrichthyes. That's a bull shark. What's unique about a bull shark compared to most sharks? Speak of it. Yeah, they can move between fresh and salt water. A lot of bull sharks have been found way up rivers, like the Mississippi River, for example. There have been sharks found close to St. Louis. How far is St. Louis from the ocean? I don't know how far, but a long, long way, okay? Kind of scary. All right, so far we've looked at the jawless fish, and obviously their big advancement to go from here to here was the development of jaws. Now we're talking about the cartilaginous fish, and we're about to move toward the bony fish. And notice it says lungs. Do fish have lungs? Some do. Very few. There are a couple that do. We'll talk about those in a minute. But before we do, let's talk about the class of bony fish in general. It's called osteichthyes. What's osteo mean? Bone. These are bony fish. They are by far the most abundant vertebrates on Earth. There are way more of them than there are of us. They have a skeleton, an internal endoskeleton, just like you, made of calcium carbonate. Same stuff your bones are made out of. What's another name for calcium carbonate? Chemistry people, what's calcium carbonate? Chalk, limestone. The same thing your bones are made out of. They, like the sharks, have that lateral line system that lets them pick up sounds and vibrations. That's something that they have that most sharks don't. You've all caught fish before, I hope, right? Everybody caught a fish? Their gills are covered up with this flap. And the flap over their gills is called the operculum. What is that flap over their gills constantly doing? It's moving. And as it's moving, what's it doing? It's pumping water over their gills, so there's a constant supply of what coming through those gills? Oxygen. Remember, fish aren't breathing the O out of H2O. They're breathing the same stuff you are, O2. And how much of that's in water? Not much. Which means to be able to breathe, they've got to have constant movement of water over their gills. This operculum does that. What do you know about some sharks? Because they don't have this. In order to breathe, they have to keep moving all the time. Some sharks do. If they stop moving, they don't breathe, they die. But bony fish, this lets them sit still and still be able to breathe, because this operculum will pump the water for them so they don't have to move. Bony fish also have swim bladder, which is sort of like an internal balloon that they can blow up or they can let air out of. If they add more air to that operculum, what happens? If you had a balloon inside you and you were in the water and you fill that balloon up with air, what would happen to you? You would rise, right? If you let air out, you're going to start to sink. So it's sort of like a float. The swim bladder is like a float. It lets them float at different heights without having to weigh. Without having to use a lot of energy to swim. So it's like a float. Most fish have external fertilization. What does that mean? It means basically the female lays the eggs on the bottom of the body of water, and then what does the male do? He comes by and basically dive bombs them with sperm. He basically just swims over the top and pours sperm all over it. There's no reproductive structure the way that we would think about it. Female lays the eggs, The male dibombs in the sperm. That's external fertilization. Would that work on land?
No, because they would.
No, because the sperm and eggs would dry out, right? But it works in the water, so that's okay for them. Most fish are said to be oviparous. Now this is a word you need to know the definition of. Anytime you see OVI, what do you think that means? Ovi. Same root means egg. They lay eggs. That's what oviparous means. They're animals that lay eggs outside their body. Oviparous. Most fish are oviparous. Now there's some exceptions to that. I can't think of any exception with bony fish, but some sharks. Here's another word you need to know. Ovoviviparous. That's a crazy looking word. Ovoviviparous. Some sharks have eggs, but where do they just stay? They stay inside the mother's body. And they hatch inside her body. And when they hatch, out comes the baby, and out comes what? Not only the baby, but what else comes out? The leftover parts of the egg. So it's like she has eggs, but she keeps them in her body in order to what? Protect them. Yep, they stay in the body to protect them. Yep.
I remember someone reading somewhere where like they had found this shark, right? Mother shark. It turns out that she had two little sharklings or whatever you call them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of them actually had killed the other one inside the mother's womb.
That's probably possible. I wouldn't doubt that's not possible at all. What else might be like this, guys? Ovoviviparous.
Sea worms.
There are some snakes like this. We're not like this. We're viviparous. What's viva mean? It means alive. It means you're born alive. You're not coming out of what? You're not coming out of a hard-shelled egg. You sort of are coming out of an egg, though, right? But not a hard-shelled. What we normally think of as an egg. So we're born alive. No eggs. Uh-huh.
So how do snakes, like, how do they, like, do they vomit the child up, or how do they do it?
No, they lay an egg. They have an opening that egg comes out of.
There.
Yeah.
Down underneath, underside. They have the same reproductive parts you have too. They're just retractable. Couple more things about fish in general. Fish tend to be ectothermic, which is a fancy word for what? Cold-blooded. Their internal temperature is dependent completely on environmental temperature. They have external fertilization, as we already mentioned. Most of them are oviparous, meaning they lay eggs outside their body. Although we also mentioned that some sharks are ovoviviparous. They have eggs that stay in the body of the mother until they hatch. Ovoviviparous. Most fish have a two-chambered heart. By the way, what is the top chambers of your heart? What are those called? Top chambers in your heart. Let me ask this question first. How many chambers in your heart, in a mammal heart? 4. You have 2 chambers on top. What are they called? They're called atria. And you have 2 chambers on the bottom, the bigger pumping chambers, and they are called ventricles. Fish have 1 of each. 1 atrium, 1 ventricle. You have 2 of each. And we'll talk about the significance of that in a minute. All right, so here's a bony fish. Most all the fish in this area of the world are bony fish, right? There are some lampreys in the Flint River, so jawless fish, but not very many. Most all the fish in the Flint River and the lakes and ponds right here are bony fish. You can see the swim bladder right in here, that internal float. You can see the hard calcium carbonate endoskeleton or axial skeleton. Here are the gills. What did we say the flap is that covers them up? The operculum. And that pumps the water so they have constant supply of oxygen. And that's kind of where we'll leave it. Also remember that lateral line runs down the middle of their body. And what does that lateral line pick up? It picks up vibrations and sounds. All right, now let's talk about this one before we go. Not time to go yet. This guy right here is called a lobe-finned fish. But some of these guys have what? They have lungs, in addition to what? Gills. What they can do is when most of the time, these kinds of animals are going to be found in streams. In Africa mostly. Streams that are seasonal. So as long as there's water, they're breathing, no problems. When the water dries up, they start breathing with their lungs. What do? Well, they don't have legs, but their fins sort of act like what? Legs. Notice their fins, those have big old lobe fins that look sort of like legs, and that lets them move. Usually what they do is they dig a hole in the bottom of the stream, burrow in, and wait it out. They wait for it to rain again. So they're breathing air, but they bury themselves in the hole and wait for it to rain again, breathing air. A lot of scientists think that these guys are the direct ancestors of what? Well, of land animals. What supposedly were the first land animals? At the top of the slide. Amphibians. Things like frogs, salamanders. But look at the slide here. Here's a lobe-finned fish. Notice where these big fins are at. About the same places these are at, the limbs. And if you look at the bone structure, and you start counting bones and such, the same kind of bones, the same number of bones are in there. They're arranged a little bit differently. But scientists say there was a mutation in those HOX genes, those main genes that control our development, that caused these things to become these things. Fins to become limbs. So supposedly the fish were the direct ancestors of the amphibians. And by the way, what does the word amphibian mean? What's like an amphibious vehicle? Both land and water. That's what it means here. Because where is part of an amphibian's life always going to have to be spent? In the water. Part of it's still on land. Amphibians can live on land, but they're not very good at it. Where do you usually find frogs?
In ponds.
Yeah, on the land, but in places where there's plenty of water. And we'll get to that later. That's a good place to stop.
And